Let's return home to Nigeria, where from an agency that hardly backs and bites, formerly known as the Consumer Protection Council, Babatunde Irukera, the Executive Vice Chairman and CEO of the Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Commission, has placed the FCCPC squarely at the heart of the Nigerian economy. The head of the FCCPC will be clocking 3 years in the saddle next month, January 2022. Join me now for this conversation with Babatunde Irukera, the Executive Vice Chairman and CEO of the FCCPC. Great to have you on the show tonight, live from our Abuja studios.
Good evening. Thank you for inviting.
Thank you for making it. We understand you're getting things wrapped up for the year, so times are very tight, as it were. So we appreciate your time this evening to come for the conversation. Let's just get started. We have a lot of grounds to cover. How much of your background in law practice actually prepared you for the challenges that you have faced at the FCCPC since you assumed in January of 2019?
I think the short answer to that is all of it. Yes, I am a lawyer. I started my legal career in corporate work as in-house counsel in a bank. Then I became the general counsel of a company. Then I became I moved out of corporate work into first administrative representation before regulators and administrative tribunals. And then I became a core litigator, trying cases before juries, and then appellate work. And I think that all of that experience put together has prepared me for this role. Essentially, the whole work of regulation is really, at the end of the day, a question of compliance and law. And so having been on the inside to ensure compliance and also representing people with respect to compliance, and then becoming sometimes a prosecutor, and certainly for the most part, defense counsel, both in criminal matters and civil matters. I think all of the skills, all of the knowledge, all of the strategy I learned over that diverse career are deployed on a daily basis in how we do our work at the FCCPC.
But what was your chief agenda for the FCCPC, the agency, when you were appointed back in January 2019, and why?
And so when I went in initially as the Director General of the Consumer Protection Council, there were two things on my mind. One was to pursue consumer protection reform that could be transformed from the regulatory space into the commercial space, meaning that the relationship between the consumers and the service or goods providers or producers would carry on. Consumers would become far more discriminatory and actually impatient with insufficient or dissatisfactory service or products. And also, businesses would understand that consumers demand a lot more and battle more for their custom. That was what I intended going in the Consumer Protection Council. But one of the things is that Nigeria had struggled to get competition legislation for approximately 19 years. And so one of my key mandates at the time was, why don't we work and see if finally this multiple time could be the charm to expand a composite competition regulatory framework to Nigeria, considering that Nigeria was one of the few countries its size in the world that didn't have a composite competition regulation system. And in fact, the only country in the world that had sold public enterprise the magnitude that we had into an economy that didn't have a competition regulator. And so going in, when competition was added, when the law changed in January 2019, the most important thing to me was fair markets, eliminating entry barriers, and watching to see if the market would correct itself. And if the market didn't correct itself, intervening using all the multiple tools in the toolbox created by the Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Act. And I'd say that I think we've moved significantly in that respect. For one thing, in the M&A space, I think there's a clearer understanding of the dynamics when companies come together, and we're analyzing that better and regulating companies better. We're watching companies better, all kinds of things. The problems are still significant, but more than ever before, at least especially in the formal sector, people understand the limitations that are imposed by a competition regulator.
But when you started, how did you determine what sectors to focus on You've crisscrossed the electricity or the power sector. You've gone to consumer goods. You've gone to aviation. We could see in some of those images at the motor parks. So you put a whole lot of boots on the ground. But how did you determine where to go first?
And so for us, the analysis was from a consumer protection standpoint, and sometimes even the congruence between consumer protection and competition was what are the areas that affect people the most? What are the areas that affect the most vulnerable people in Nigeria? What are the services they need most? Where do they seem most exploited? And so electricity, telecommunications, banking and other financial institution issues were key on our minds. And then there were other targets of opportunity. For instance, if we became aware or some of credible intelligence came to us about something that was going wrong in a particular industry or the other, it becomes a target of opportunity which would immediately strike to address what the problem is. And so we also realized that there were other sectors that were not core, but were ancillary or corollaries. For instance, you look at pay TV. That wouldn't have seemed as something many vulnerable Nigerians subscribe to, but it turns out that we're not entirely correct, especially when you're thinking of sports. You look at something like aviation, but as insecurity continued to become more problematic, aviation became the preferred means of travel. So we had to immediately intervene in that area too. And so it's a very dynamic space, and we're prioritizing based on what we think, what our national priorities are, or the national situation that needs to be addressed.
We've heard a few things about how powerful the FCCPC is and what fundamental impact could these powers have on the Nigerian economy. Some folks are beginning to fear that FCCPC is so powerful that you could dabble in virtually everything and virtually everything as far as competition and consumer is, because life is still about consumption, whether it's good, products, services, whatever it is, in the air, in the water, whatever, private sector, public sector. So how really powerful is the act that set up the FCCPC and the additions that you got that made you someone to be feared in the Nigerian economy space?
So for me, the anxiety that you clearly articulated is actually welcome. What I would have been concerned about is if people were anxious of being subjected to abuse, or if their concerns were based on a pattern of regulatory conduct that was abusive or inappropriate, then I'll be concerned. But to the extent that people are concerned that there's a regulator that the law empowers, has the tools, has both the will, the desire and the will to enforce the law, I think that's very good, and that's quite welcome, and I'll take that as an endorsement of our work. Now, with respect to the reality of what the powers are, it's not anything that is unusual or uncommon, as it were, in any other country. A competition regulator and then a composite competition regulator and an apex consumer protection regulator must necessarily go everywhere. And there are many models that show that that's the case. It's not unusual that a sector regulator would sometimes have conflicts inherent in their role. For instance, if I'm your licensor and I've licensed you and I've permitted you to do certain things, if what I've permitted you to do results in injury to someone, I have an internal conflict of I permitted you in the first place. And many times that's even an initial defense by the operator. Secondly, and perhaps not even necessarily intentionally, the fact that I'm your licensor and my subsistence is based on the fees you pay me make me have to look out for you. For instance, mergers and acquisition was with the Securities and Exchange Commission before the FCCPA came. Now, mergers and acquisition are a tool of competition to make the market fair. Why is it important for the market to be fair? Pricing, quality, choices, it's all about consumer protection. But what is the Securities and Exchange Commission created to do? Protect investors. It's to make sure that investors are sufficiently protected. So when you entrust a role for protecting the consumers to a regulator who's to look out for shareholder value, then you can see that there's an inherent conflict. And so what it is that what seems to be all this power in reality is a platform for a composite, independent, autonomous regulator to engage in the market, and in many cases, as we do, by collaborating with the sector regulators too.
Well, we'll talk a little bit about your activities so far in 2021 because you're touching a very important. Let's talk about interagency cooperation and collaboration. It looks like you are ruffling quite some feathers down there in the maritime industry. What are you looking for down there in shipping in ports?
Well, the one thing I can assure you is that we're not looking for fish, but we're fishing. If you think about it, shipping in a country where consumption is largely of, Nigeria's greatest asset is the market, far more than it is than oil or any other resource. And so we're a country that imports the vast majority of what we consume. And so if you look at the logistic cost from shipping and all of that, and how it adds to the real cost of doing business, and more than anything else, the costs that are transferred to consumers, you can understand why. And I'll give you an example. Over 13 months, shipping from a key port in China to Lagos moved from about $4,000 to about $14,000. And yes, COVID has changed many things across the world, including the supply chain, increasing the cost of shipping significantly, but not necessarily astronomically. And so we're doing the math, we're looking at this, and we're conducting our intelligence gathering and discovering that there are some kinds of conversations that are going on in the space that are against the law. And so, for instance, how do you determine that shipping would cost exactly the same thing across all liners? Why? Their input costs are different. The kind of equipment they operate are different. The cost of operating those equipment are significantly different. Their payroll, their wage system, their internal, their costs are different. And so why would, and if you have your margins, if you have a margin model that says for your business you want to make 40% or 30%, then so long as you're at your margin, your cost should be along that line. So why would the cost be exactly the same thing? And so we started looking. And so we went in there. We had to convince a court that we had gathered some credible intelligence that provided probable cause and sufficient basis for us to go in. And so the court issued a warrant, and we conducted a dawn raid on 5 out of very many companies, and there's still more to come. And what we've gathered so far shows that there are all kinds of violations of the Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Act. For once, there are all kinds of exclusive arrangements and restrictive understandings that slice the market in a way that prevents competition and does not promote entry for smaller players. We've also discovered that there are some types of discussions that were going on between some of the companies at an association level. That is a violation of law. We also discovered that there are some of the companies had a competitive advantage because they were breaking the law in the sense that they were transporting products from Nigeria that are on a contraband list that are not supposed to be exported from Nigeria. And so we found quite a few things. The investigation is still in the early days. I anticipate it will go on for many more months. And I think that the nature of the operations in that industry is likely to change when this is over.
Are you getting the cooperation of other agencies within the maritime space and elsewhere for all that you are doing, putting your nose in everybody's business?
The answer to that is yes. I think what we're doing is we're putting our nose in our mutual businesses with other people. But yes, the other regulator in shipping is the Shippers Council. We have very collaborative relationship with them. As a matter of fact, they visited us in courtesy. We visited them. We have literally a final draft on a memorandum of understanding that didn't just start yesterday. It started a while ago. And so perhaps what you've seen are workers in the industry who are displeased with the legal operation, I might say, of another regulator, and who, as many companies sometimes do, try to pitch the regulators against each other. We're not concerned. We're not concerned at all.
Well, I still get crazy bills from the discos, as many Nigerians, and I'm still not satisfied with the digital satellite television providers because so these are some of the very few areas that Nigerians are worried that they want to feel the impact of what Babatunde Irukera is doing. So you have a lot of protection to do here moving forward. Tell me about it. Is it a done deal? You had a number of arrangements, town hall meetings with the discos and consumers. Some of them were in those images we showed earlier. But then it looks like some of those practices in the electricity sector with the digital television or whatever are still there. folks are still concerned.
So what we're doing is palliative, and essentially it's like fixing the potholes on a failing road. You keep doing it the best you can. You make the road somewhat moderable, but certainly not the best possible efficiency. So looking at the electricity sector and then looking at pay TV, for instance, there are structural changes that need to occur in those markets. For instance, in pay TV, the competition needs to just get better. I can say to you, based on our interventions, the complaints in pay TV have gone down significantly, not eliminated. And based on our intervention, what seems to be routine, periodic price increases, which sometimes were not even annual, has not occurred as it has. But then there are other factors in the market. Foreign exchange is changing, and all of that also affect their business. But one of the things you would see also is that prices and increases are not only affected just because you have a sheriff looking. Competition is arising. Netflix is presenting a competition to the traditional cable television or satellite television systems. And so you see that that's a very key thing. And that's why, if you remember what I said at the beginning, is the first thing we set out to do is to eliminate the entry barriers, the restrictive agreements, the barriers that made it difficult or impossible for others to enter. When others are able to enter, many times the market will fix itself or correct itself. If it doesn't, then we would intervene using other tools. With respect to electricity, if you remember, one of the things I said is that if we had a competition legislation, the privatizations that were done would not have been done in the way. And so what we have with the electricities, for instance, are statutory or naturally or contractually created monopolies. In every market, each of the discos has exclusivity. We didn't privatize this in such a way that Ikeja and Eko, who are both in Lagos, could compete for customers in Ogudu, for instance. Don't enter my space, I won't enter your space. You've segmented the market in a legitimate manner. If the companies did this by themselves under the law today, people will go to jail. But we created it. And so there are structural changes that need to happen from the consumer protection side. There's only one thing that is worse than a public monopoly, and that's a private monopoly. A public monopoly is inefficient, but doesn't care whether it makes money or not. A private monopoly is not necessarily efficient because there's no incentive to become efficient, but cares to make money. And so many people were not metered when it was NEPA, and we're still struggling with trying to increase that capacity for metering. What we are also discovering in the commission is that there's no incentive. I mean, the discourse might say that they're doing their best, that they prefer to be metered, but many times what we're discovering from our engagement and the complaints is there's no incentive, because to the extent that they can continue the estimated billing, then there is no real value for service proposition, because it is arbitrary. And until we're able to stop that, and indeed we worked with the NERC and in 2019, ultimately created the billing cap regulations, but there are a bunch of other things that need to come together before we can jointly enforce that in the strictest sense of the word. And so what we'll continue to do from the FCCPC side and also from the consumer protection side in the NERC is the palliative. We will continue to fix the potholes in the road while we're waiting for the contracts to completely reconstruct the road.
Okay, so how much have you done so far in 2021? Give me just about a minute or so to review your activities for the outgoing year. Are you having so much to bite at the agency?
Well, I mean, we are having a lot to bite. I won't say we're biting more than we can chew, but we're certainly burning the candle from both ends. We've done quite some enforcement work in consumer protection. And some of our biggest investigations so far in the competition aspect, you just mentioned one of them. We've got another 2 or 3 open. There's a big one in oil and gas, a big one in a fast-moving consumer good of major multinationals, which are closing sometime next year. From the consumer protection side, we've butted heads with even some of the other professional regulators. We opened a large investigation with respect to medical services which ultimately became very contentious to the point where the MDCN got involved and actually barred doctors from appearing before the commission. That has since resolved itself because we stood our grounds and we're engaging in a manner that is collaborative. And I'd like to say that out of that investigation, so far 3 doctors have already been charged before the Medical and Dental Tribunal for inappropriate and professional misconduct. So I'd say that it's been quite a tough year, but there's still a long road to travel, but we've traveled far more from last year than where we were the year before. Okay,
for 2022, if I have a 6 a.m. flight and it's delayed till 4 p.m., will the FCCPC be able to ensure that the airline gives me a very decent meal, not just some kind of biscuits, crumbs, and some whatever, but just give me a decent lunch because my flight's delayed for 4-6 hours and I'm just sitting at the airport losing time? Give me that in 30 seconds.
That's a very good question. The airlines repeatedly blame infrastructure deficits and potential technical issues like weather and just the size of fleets because most of our airlines don't have large fleets anyway. And so if one goes down, one plane out of 4, 5, or 6 goes down, it will affect the scheduling for the whole day. And we understand that. But what we are saying is that we must move to a better sense of sensitivity and responsiveness, meaning that you must be more transparent, you must tell people, and when you can do it ahead, let them know. And like you rightly said, you must now show more responsiveness by providing some amelioration where possible. You must now come into some mutual understanding with each other so that you can put people on different airlines to get them out, and also relax your refund and rebooking policies so that people have the flexibility when problems arise.
I like that. Thank you so much. I'll remember you. I'll let them know the next time I get there. Thank you so much, Babatunde Irukera, Executive Vice Chairman and CEO at the Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Commission. Do have a great evening.